everyone, and welcome to episode 226 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. She's one of the most famous figures in history, married to 2 kings, mother to 3, and a powerful duchess in her own right. I'm speaking, of course, about Eleanor of Aquitaine. The subject of plays, novels, and movies, Eleanor was perhaps most famously played by the incomparable Katharine Hepburn last century. But this legendary queen was also the subject of a tremendous amount of speculation and gossip in her own time, even fueling some truly memorable 13th century fan fiction. This week, I spoke with Dr. Karen Sullivan about the rumors and fictions surrounding Eleanor of Aquitaine. Karen is the Irma Brandis Professor of Romance Literature and Culture at Bard College and the author of The Danger of Romance, Truth, Fantasy, and Arthurian Fictions, The Inner Lives of Medieval Inquisitors, and The Interrogation of Joan of Arc. Her new book is Eleanor of Aquitaine, as it was said, Truth and Tales about the Medieval Queen. Our conversation on what makes Eleanor such an interesting figure to speculate about, her famous relationships, and her infamous relationships, is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Karen, to talk about one of the most exciting figures of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. It is so nice to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Danielle, so much for having me on here. I'm always so happy to talk about her.
She's a wonderful figure, and I can't wait to talk about her. So let's just jump right in. For the people who have never heard this name before, who is Eleanor of Aquitaine in broad strokes?
So in broad strokes, she is Queen of France and then Queen of England. There was a famous book written in the 1950s about her called Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Four Kings. And for some reason, sometimes that title stays in people's minds because she's associated with her first husband, who was Louis VII, King of France, and then her second husband, who became Henry II, King of England. It was kind of funny because one of the reasons it's often thought that Louis divorced her and married another woman is that she only gave him 2 daughters after many years of marriage. But then the second she marries Henry, she has all of these children. She has 8 children. Half girls, half boys. And so some of the most famous of them all are Richard the Lionheart, who most people have heard of, and then John, King John. So Richard the Lionheart is remembered very fondly as the kind of great king. There's still a statue of him outside Parliament in London. And John is the bad king. People often know him from stories about Robin Hood, for example, the Magna Carta. And the barons kind of revolted against him. So she's often defined by the very powerful men she's married to or she gave birth to, but she's fascinating for so many more reasons as well. She's a quote, strong woman character. And I think that's what attracts people to her.
Yes, absolutely. And your book is really focused on the things that people said about her at the time and the things that people said about her since. But let's start walking through her chronology, her lifetime, because the rumors about her start pretty early. So how does she become the Queen of France to begin with?
Oh, well, that's kind of an interesting thing itself. We know nothing about Eleanor until her father dies. He was Duke of Aquitaine, and it was an interesting thing. He went on a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela, the famous church and kind of locus of pilgrimage to the present day. And he died there. And it was considered a very moving death. And there are apocryphal stories, that kind of make him survive and become a saint, etc. He's often looked upon as a saint. But anyway, Eleanor, at the age of what we think is probably 15, inherited Aquitaine, which is a whole swath of kind of was now Western France, extremely wealthy on the coast, involving both in what's now northern and southern France. She was by far the most wealthy heiress in all of Europe, and therefore the most powerful. So imagine being 15 years old and inheriting that amount of land and power. And what they're afraid of immediately, and they're right to be afraid of this, is that she's going to be abducted, because that's happened all the time. And I have a whole discussion of this. Heiresses were regularly abducted by men who kind of wanted their fortunes, because women could inherit property, which is great. But it also means that if you're a man who's ambitious, you're going to often want to abduct a woman and forcibly marry her so you can basically get her land. And so they're able to keep Eleanor safe, but that the King of France has this job of finding her a spouse. And he says, my son, Louis, So her, the son is kind of shipped off to Bordeaux, where she is at that one moment, and he marries her. But he comes in with an army because he's afraid that there's going to be resistance to him, other people trying to marry her. But the marriage goes off. She marries him, and just a couple of weeks later, the king dies. He was very fat. His name was Louis the Fat. It was very, very hot. He was already suffering from medical conditions. But very shortly after she becomes married to Louis, her husband, she becomes Queen of France at the age of 15.
So quickly. And as you say, it was dicey from the moment her dad died.
Yeah,
she has
absolutely.
many close shaves in her lifetime, and this is when it
Exactly.
starts.
It's a great way of putting it. Absolutely.
So she marries the soon-to-be King of France, quickly becomes Queen of France. And then shortly after that, in relative terms, they head off on crusade. And this is when people really start to talk about her. So give us that scenario.
Exactly. There's hardly anything that's said about her. In the historical records, it's mentioned when she gets married, and then there's hardly anything said about her for many years. She doesn't have a child, which is the number one job she has to have, is to produce a child. There's one story that we have where she approaches Bernard of Clairvaux, who's one of the most powerful churchmen of this time. He's a Cistercian abbot, and they get into an argument about one thing, but then she kind of bursts into tears and says she's really unhappy because she doesn't have a child. And so he kind of promises her if they can make a deal about, something the king is up to, that she will have a child. And it all works out. She gets a child, but a daughter, so that doesn't really count. But after that, Louis and Eleanor go on crusade, and this is a remarkable thing. This is going to be the second crusade. The first crusade was at the end of the 11th century. That's when they established the Crusader kingdom. But they've already lost some of the Crusader kingdom. Edessa fell to the Muslims. So this is the first time a crowned king or queen has headed off on crusade, and Eleanor is with him. So this is a remarkable thing. And as you say, this is when all the rumors start, without question.
Yeah, it gets tangled up. So they end up, it's a disaster. They lose soldiers all along the way.
Exactly.
They end up in Antioch, which is ruled by Eleanor's uncle. And then what happens?
I know, this is the exciting part. The whole question of Antioch, what happened in Antioch? So they've just kind of gone through this whole, they were ambushed by the Muslims. They lost a huge number of men. They have been probably half the army they started out with, but they arrive in Antioch, which is a very powerful, very prosperous city. And Eleanor's uncle, who's young, he's just a couple of years older than she is Prince of Antioch. And he wants to get their army. And we have a remarkable number of records of what happened here. He had a whole procession lined up when they're arriving. Everyone's greeting them, all the noblemen there in their kind of beautiful clothes. He has them welcomed, feted. He seems to have had a theatrical production that was kind of developed for them. And during this time, he's speaking to the king and the queen, and speaking to a lot of their important people, and trying to drum up support for Louis to lend him his army so he can fight his neighbors. And Louis says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to head on to Jerusalem. I'm going to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And, Crusaders were primarily pilgrims. They refer to themselves as pilgrims. And Louis is referred to as Louis the Pious. So he wants to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as a pilgrim. And then he says, I'm going to kind of take counsel with the Great Council in Jerusalem, and I'm going to figure out what they want me to do. So I'm not just here for you, Raymond of Antioch. And then Raymond, unsurprisingly, gets annoyed at that. He's been such a great host. He thought he had this in with Eleanor. And then it's a great, great mystery. So all of that is pretty agreed upon. But then what happened after that is disputable. So what the records all say, either he persuaded Eleanor to kind of be on his side, that he kind of seduced her by getting her to ally herself with him against her husband. And it does seem clear that that happened, that she was kind of supporting Raymond against her own husband and had an argument with her own husband against her. But there's also an allegation that he had some type of more dubious contact with her.
Mm-hmm.
The phrase that is used in Latin is rapuit, raptus, which is a complicated phrase. It can mean seize, it can mean seduce, it can mean rape. We get the word rape from this. So we have three kind of major primary accounts, one of which just condemns her and says that she broke her marital vows without saying whom she broke them with. without blaming Raymond for anything. And one of them suggests that Raymond abducted Eleanor and took her away from her husband, away from her own ladies, and that she was after that accused of having broken her marital vows, but under a situation of physical duress. So that's something that people have not talked about enough. I mean, there's a huge ambiguity about what constitutes. The definition of rape in the 12th century is to take a woman without the permission of her guardians. I mean, if a woman wants to elope with you and is just totally happy to run off with you, that can still count as rape if it's not with the permission of her guardians. And so her own will doesn't really play into this here. So as I say, this is one of the things I find most fascinating about her, is that uncertainty of kind of what Eleanor's own will was and what happened in Antioch.
Yeah, we always have to look at who is writing this down. And it's always going to be dudes who are affiliated with the church. And that really
exactly
colors how they look at her. So while she's there, there's also a few rumors that she may have had an affair not with Raymond. But some people, even in later, especially I think in later times, have associated her with Saladin. What's going on there?
I know. Now, this is where it gets really kind of fun in some kind of fictionalized way. I mean, I do think the most important and influential chronicle was William of Tyre, who wrote in Latin, but then the chronicle was translated into French and became extremely popular. He's also a really, really good writer. And he says she broke her marriage vows. But he loves Raymond of Antioch. He completely is the great hero of the Crusades. The guy died in battle, kind of fighting against Muslims. So he's not going to blame Raymond for anything bad here. And he explicitly says that Raymond never broke his marriage vows. So the question is, okay, so whom did she do it with? I mean, there's one guy, Joan of Salisbury, who quotes a eunuch associated with Louis, who insinuates by a kind of allusion to Ovid that this was an incestuous kind of relationship with her uncle. But even John casts doubt upon that. So I think that she was accused of infidelity towards her husband, but the partner in crime was never clearly identified in the 12th century. So it kind of opens the question to who was her lover. So very, very early in the 13th century, there were some references by Matthew Paris that she was even said to have consorted with a Saracen or a Turk. He uses kind of both phrases. And he puts that in addition to another person, so presumably a French person she consorted with. But things really get interesting in 1260, when this fascinating writer called the Minstrel of France, we have no idea who his name is. He's probably just a minstrel, but he's a very, very entertaining writer. He writes in French. So he comes up with the story that Eleanor was disgusted by Louis, her husband, and by what the poor showman who was making on the crusade. And it certainly is true. He was a disastrous leader of crusade, and he was not, as I say, he was not eager to fight. He just wanted to go off and be pious and go to Jerusalem. And she was very impressed by Saladin. And Saladin, in case people don't know, was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He united all the Muslims against him. He would take back Jerusalem and a huge swath of the Crusader kingdom in 1187. He was also famously chivalrous and courteous. He's kind of the epitome of what chivalry means in the West. And that's how he's represented in Western chronicles. So, okay, Eleanor was interesting. And then Saladin is really interesting.
Yeah.
So therefore, ergo, they must have gotten together, right? They're both on crusade. Who is a French woman going to fall in love with aside from Saladin? He's the epitome of a chivalric hero. So the story that the minstrel comes up with is that Eleanor sends Saladin a letter basically saying, Saladin, I don't like my husband, but I hear you are really good. Come and get me. And he says, she's a very wealthy woman. I'm going to come and get her. And so he sends a galley, to where she's staying. Someone kind of arrives and tells her at night, Eleanor, the galley has arrived. She takes her maidens and her coffer of her great wealth. And the great part of the story is that she gets to the galley and she puts one foot on the ship. It's one of these lovely details. But then she's been betrayed by one of her maidens, and Louis shows up. And I think it's such a great story because Louis, he doesn't yell at her, he doesn't beat her, he doesn't berate her. He just is very sad. He just says, why do you want to leave me? And then she says, because you're not worth a pair. And so Louis goes to his barons. He says, what should I do with this wife of mine? And the barons say, she's impossible. She's a very wicked woman and she may kill you. So you better get rid of her, right? Which he will do. There's one of my favorite aspects of the story, which I have spent a lot of time talking about, is the barons also accuse her of being a demon.
Hmm.
At this time. And that's a whole other kind of, part of the story. But Louis does repudiate her, or, there are also allegations, but there are also allegations that Eleanor repudiated him. And she just
Hmm.
engineered it all because she wanted to get rid of him, because she wasn't impressed by him. And there's no doubt about that. On the way back from Crusade, Eleanor and Louis end up near Rome where they see the Pope, and he provides some kind of marital counseling to them. He actually kind of puts them into bed and tucks them in and tells them to have sex. And she actually does have another child, a daughter. 2 years pass before the marriage is ended. But, there are claims that it was actually Eleanor who arranged the dissolution. So it's again a kind of fascinating ambiguity, in the text itself as to what was really going on here. It was a really stupid thing for Louis to get rid of her because it lost the wealthiest part of his kingdom. And because she marries a man after that who becomes King of England.
Yeah.
And he takes all of that land and it becomes part of the English crown for a time after that. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, Louis the Pious doesn't seem to have any amount of forethought in general.
No,
So,
no.
you
Well,
know,
that's the mystery. That's why people have these speculations because it was such a stupid thing to do. People speculate there must have been other reasons for it, like she was a demon or something like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So just to be clear to the listeners at home, the whole demon and Saladin thing is just fiction. It's fan fiction. But we do know that Eleanor
Totally
and
fan
Louis,
fiction.
yeah, Eleanor and Louis had a big old fight in
Yeah.
the Holy Land. They came home, they had one more daughter, but then they did get their marriage annulled. And as you say, then things went south. And people were making rumors at the time that
Mhm.
Eleanor initiated the proceedings so that she could marry Henry, who's going to be King of England. That's what
Yes,
people
yeah.
were saying at the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, Henry at this point, his mother had a claim on the English throne. She was the daughter of Henry the First. It was a complicated issue, because Matilda, she's referred to as the Empress Matilda because she had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor. And so his mother had actually tried to win the throne for herself, and there had been a civil war, and referred to as the anarchy as a result of this. But, there was a King Stephen, who claimed the throne and was able to rule as king. And obviously, he wants to pass on the throne to his own son. So Henry's claim on the throne is not clear cut, and it's not obvious that he's going to get it. And one of the things about Henry is he's one of the luckiest people throughout all of history. Stephen's son dies, fortuitously. And so Eleanor, who married Louis, and then his father died, and she became Queen of France. She marries Henry of Anjou, which is a neighboring area to Aquitaine. And then, lo and behold, Stephen dies, and his son dies, and then Henry's able pretty easily to become King of England. So
Hmm.
she's also pretty lucky.
I think that it's pretty easy, even if you're just looking at the cold chronicles, and as factual as we can get is the
Yeah.
chronicles. It looks like Eleanor's relationship with Louis was pretty cold, but her relationship with Henry was combustible. As you say, they have a whole bunch
Exactly.
of kids pretty quickly, right?
Exactly. Exactly. There's a great line attributed to her by a chronicler, but he quotes Eleanor as saying that Louis was more of a monk than a king,
Yeah.
which actually is a pretty good characterization with her. I mean, the thing I find fascinating is that even when these chroniclers were condemning Eleanor for having broken her marriage vows, for having mean to Louis, I said they actually kind of agree with her. She's actually kind of the spokesperson for their own views about Louis. But as you say, Henry was just first of all, he was much younger than Eleanor. He was a man of incredible energy and dynamism, perhaps too much, actually. He was the complete opposite of Louis in terms of his energy, his desire to fight, his capacity to be a ruler and a warrior. So, you could very much see why Eleanor was attracted to him. And there are chronicles that say that she kind of lusted after him,
Hmm.
which may be just projection. But it fits in as a story, it fits in.
Yes. Yeah. And it's nice to imagine that sometimes you can have an arranged marriage. I don't know who arranged this marriage. And that's one of the things that has a lot of rumors
Yeah.
around it, that it
Mhm.
could work out, at least for a while. But then things start to go south between the two of them because
Right.
the sons start to rebel and Eleanor
Exactly.
is blamed for that. So tell us what happens.
Yeah, well, that's where it gets. I don't know if anyone ever still watches In the Line in Winter with Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole. I actually really like that movie, but it focuses upon the sons' rebellion against their father. So as I say, she had a lot of children, both sons and daughters with Henry, and all of them are fascinating figures. All of them are strong, kind of Shakespearean characters. Why
Hmm.
she only wrote a play about John is a great mystery. But anyway, so so she has all these children in very quick succession, and there's not a whole lot going on in her life aside from that. I mean, she's not a powerful ruler. Henry is the one who's ruling her lands in his own at this point. But then the problem is that the oldest son, whose name is also Henry, and because Henry, the king, had so much difficulty, and his mother had so much difficulty asserting the right to a throne, they decide they're going to imitate the Capetians, the French monarchs, and they're going to have his son crowned while he himself is alive. Because this is what the French kings have always done. It has always worked out well for the French kings. It doesn't work out for Henry because the young king is also a very vigorous, kind of person, a great warrior, famously handsome, famously charming, and one of the most popular rulers ever, probably in European history. His
Hmm.
men adored him. The troubadour poems that were sung about him are incredible. But at a certain point, he says, listen, I'm a crowned king and I have no kingdom. I have nothing to rule. Richard, my younger brother, was given Aquitaine and nominally to rule. Even his younger brother, John, was given some land. But I have nothing to rule of my own. And so he felt kind of emasculated, I think one could probably say,
Hmm.
by being impotent, militarily. He had also married the daughter of the King of France, of course, his mother's ex-husband's new child. And so it's a little complicated. And so at a certain point, they're all in what's now France, and he decides to rebel. And he does it in cahoots with Louis and with obviously his wife, Margaret, who's an interesting character, and with Eleanor. And the chronicles don't say a whole lot about Eleanor's role, but a lot of them say that she instigated the rebellion, that she was the one behind this, and that particularly that she was the one who got Richard and the younger brother, Geoffrey of Brittany, to kind of go along with the young king. Henry was able to arrest her pretty quickly and ship her back to England along with Margaret, the young king's wife, and he kept her in prison, for a long time. So we don't hear a whole lot about her activity in the rebellion, but she was certainly on the son's side. And the thing that's interesting is that Henry is able to kind of overcome the rebellion and reassert control over his kingdom and his sons. And he was actually very, very generous towards the sons. He forgave them. The young king is allowed to travel about and go to tournaments and have a nice life. The same was true of Richard and of Geoffrey. But Henry never forgave Eleanor. She was in prison for the rest of Henry's life.
Yeah, and I think that as other people have said since that time, that's almost more telling than what we can get from the chroniclers. Like we can imagine that the chroniclers have an agenda, but the fact that Henry himself thinks that Eleanor is enough of a troublemaker that he needs her out of the way for the rest of his life is very telling.
Well, and she did have a bond, particularly with Richard. And the young king dies in the course of another rebellion against his father.
Hmm.
And so Richard is the heir apparent, and Richard is Richard the Lionheart. I mean,
Yeah.
this is someone to be reckoned with. One of the things that's very striking about Eleanor is that she had such a close bond with every single one of her children.
Hmm.
And even though they're all fighting against each other, as well as against Henry, that she's really the number one person in all of their lives. Some of the chroniclers kind of say this. Henry was afraid that she would instigate another rebellion, but certainly kind of looking at her hold over Richard, over Geoffrey, over even over John, he had reason to be worried about what she would do if she was allowed to have her influence felt among those children.
Yes, it's incredible, really, because you think usually the Queen Mother has to be distant for all sorts of reasons, complicated reasons. But as you
Mhm.
say, she's so tight with all of her sons, even when they're fighting against each other. It is an anomaly.
And this is why, as I say, the movie The Lion and Winter tries to figure it out because
Hmm.
it's difficult. I mean, I think I did figure it out. I mean, I feel like I figured it out in the course of the book because as long as kind of, for example, Richard would be king, she would support Richard, but she also kind of made clear her love for John and also the daughters. I mean, she was very close to the daughters as well, who tend to get, neglected, given how interesting they are.
Yes. And one of the things that you have in here, because you talk at the about the end of Eleanor's life and how she ends up spending a lot of
Mhm.
time at Fontevraud, although she doesn't become a nun until right at the
Yeah.
end. But her daughter
Yeah.
Joan joins her. And what's interesting about that is Joan, as you mentioned in the book, she gets in trouble several times and she's going to her brother for help. And he's there for her to the point at which when
Mm.
Richard is killed and he forgives the person who's killed him, Joan does not. And so the tightness of this
Exactly.
family is really
Exactly.
interesting
Oh,
on
it's
its own.
extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I mean, you can see why it's led to so many novels and also novelized histories. Of both chapters, I will say that the one about Fontevraud, the abbey where Eleanor ends up in her 80s, let it be said, that was actually my favorite one. I felt like I was able to kind of get to, I mean, everyone knows Richard the Lionheart, but this material at the end, people haven't done a whole lot with it. There is no account of Eleanor's life at Fontevraud insofar as one can say that she spent time there. So you have to kind of pull together evidence from a lot of different sources, which is what I did. And particularly Joan fascinated me. I mean, to me, she's one of the great characters of medieval history and has been utterly neglected.
Mhm.
She was the youngest daughter that Eleanor had with Henry. What's interesting, she becomes Queen of Sicily, at a very young age, which would be typical. Her husband and the King of Sicily died. They had no children. And someone usurped the kingdom, including the property that Joan was supposed to inherit legally. And so she's in a difficult position there in Sicily. Her husband's dead. This usurper's taken over the island. But, what can happen? Richard the Lionheart shows up,
Mhm.
en route to the Third Crusade. So again, Eleanor was involved and Louis were in the Second Crusade. When Saladin takes over Jerusalem, you have the Third Crusade. And so this is when Richard and then Louis, son, which he finally had with his third wife, Philip Augustus, Richard and Philip gang up together and they go on crusade. But en route to the Holy Land, Richard stops by Sicily and then takes over the island
Yeah.
and saves his sister. I mean, he's kind of the brother you wish you had, right? And he makes a deal with Joan. He says, "Can I have your money? I need some money for this crusade." And she says, "Okay." He's gotten her money back. So she has the money. So she lends it to him for the purpose of this crusade. And then she goes on the crusade too. You know,
Hmm.
and one of my favorite little episodes is that, they arrive in the Holy Land and she needs to get married. You need a husband. And so there's a question of whom she's going to marry. And there's a whole story about arrangements for her to marry not Saladin, but Saladin's brother.
Hmm.
And this is, I think, one of the great stories. There's actually a whole work about this written in Arabic at the time because it's such a dramatic story. The story is that if they had gotten married, there would be a Muslim king of Jerusalem and a Christian queen of Jerusalem, and they would have co-ruled the whole lands, which is such a kind of lovely idea. And the chroniclers say, Joan said, "Oh, no, this is terrible. I'm not going to have sex with a Muslim. What a terrible idea." But then there are other sources that say she was actually really attracted to him and they flirted. And also, what I love is that the idea that she wore kohl, she put kohl, Kohl, the kind of the makeup of the Middle East to make her eyes glitter. But then, then the ecclesiastics say, "No, this can't happen. This isn't going to, so it never happens." But it's a great story and of her going on. So that you can see there's a way in which these completely apocryphal stories about Eleanor having an affair with Saladin, that didn't happen. But it did happen that her daughter could have married Saladin's brother. So then they go back to France. Joan marries the Count of Toulouse. They seem to have had a very unhappy marriage. He was a heretic, for one thing. And Joan is a very formidable woman. There are lots of things that she does. At one point, some of her husband's men revolt against him, and she's the one who goes and tries to put down the rebellion. But then her own men betray her and kind of set fire to the camp, and she barely escapes. And so she says, "Okay, I'm just going to go to Richard." But Richard, she just heard, has now been killed.
Hmm.
And so she goes to Eleanor instead. And she goes to this abbey where she herself had been raised, the Abbey of Fontevraud. And she gets in touch with the nuns there. She says that she wants to become a nun there. They say to her, Joan, you're pregnant, you're married, you can't become a nun. And she says, please, please, please. And also she's dying. And, she gives birth to the child, or perhaps it's taken from her by cesarean section. The child dies as well. It seems to have been named after Richard. And so, she died. They allow her to die as a nun of Fontevraud. And Eleanor is there holding her in her arms as she dies. So I just think that's a story we haven't heard enough, about Eleanor and about her connection with her daughter.
Yeah, yeah. And she was actually there at the death of Richard as well.
Exactly,
She came
exactly.
out and was at his side. She wrote words to that effect herself,
Yeah,
or
exactly,
through a
exactly.
scribe. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah.
so close. And she keeps going back to Fontevraud, and then she
Yeah.
keeps being pulled out of retirement to put out John's fires.
Or leaving of her own will out of retirement. I don't know which
Yeah.
one we want to put it, where we want to put it.
Yeah.
At one point, there's a question of Philip Augustus's and his son, whom is he going to marry? And she says, how about my granddaughter?
Hmm.
And so she actually travels to Spain in her 80s to kind of pick
Yeah.
up her granddaughter and then bring her back to marry the Dauphin to France. One thing that can be said about Eleanor is she liked to travel.
Yeah.
She's in Jerusalem. By the way, I didn't mention that when she and when Richard and Joan were in Sicily, she went to see them in Sicily.
Hmm.
When Richard is kidnapped on the way back from the crusade and is held a prisoner in Germany, she goes to Germany to release him. So she made an incredible number of trips. Another thing too is that the older she gets, the more powerful she gets, which is
Hmm.
I think it's very striking because in our society, usually, a woman's status does not go up as she ages. But
Yeah.
in that society, that's what happened.
Well, probably a lot of it has to do with reputation because not only does she have a lot of lands that were her inheritance, but when people go up against her, they lose again and again.
It's true. It's true.
That has to have something to do with it. All right. So you looked at Eleanor's biography as closely as you could get it through chronicles, but then you decided to look at fiction as well, or fiction adjacent type work. Why
Yeah,
did you
yeah,
decide to
yeah.
do that?
Fiction adjacent is a good phrase, here. There's never, I think, been a good phrase for describing these texts. I mean, there's a kind of larger question about the relationship between literature, and history in the Middle Ages. And this is a big, big issue. There's been in the book that I wrote before this about romance, a lot of it was concerned with this. A lot of what we refer to as romances, were referred to as histoire in the Middle Ages, histories. A lot of the histories were written in French verse. So a lot of the ways in which we would distinguish fiction and history were not relevant for this time period. I mean, I mentioned the Minstrel of France. It was one of my favorite sources on Eleanor or about anything. And he has lots of stories about a lot of people. And it's a very complicated text. It's written in French prose. It's anecdotal. A lot of stories, like the one about Eleanor trying to run off with Saladin, are completely not true. I mean, Saladin was like 9 years old the time she was in the Holy Land. This just did not happen. But then a lot of the other stories he tells are actually true. And they're actually the best records of what happened, of anything that we have, as far as one can ascertain historically. So it's a complicated situation. I mean, the thing that strikes me is that I'm a literature professor. I'm not a historian. And so what I really like to do is just grab onto a text and hold on to it and see where it leads me. Whether it's a proper historical account, it's well respected as, history, or whether it's something like the Minstrel of France, or even just a rumor, or even a poem, a lyric poem of which we have some references. And the thing that kind of strikes me is that I mean, for example, in the Minstrel of France, and when the barons are talking with Louis about whether he should get rid of Eleanor, they said, you should get rid of her because she hasn't given you a child, by which they mean a male child. And the thing is that the vast majority of historians, when they talk about why Louis wanted to get rid of Eleanor, will cite that as a reason. They will
Mhm.
claim that he got rid of her because he needed a male heir and he didn't have one after all of these years of marriage to her. But the thing that's striking is that the Minstrel of France is the only record from the Middle Ages that mentions that as a reason
Mhm.
why Louis got rid of Eleanor. We
Yeah.
have countless chroniclers who talk about why Louis got rid of her. And not one of them mentions this as a reason.
Mhm.
Why Sometimes I think historians can kind of pick and choose because it seems to them reasonable. It seemed like the reason that he should have wanted to get rid of her. This is
Mhm.
kind of what they pay attention to. But
Mhm.
to me, it seems important that it's only the minstrel of Wales who says this. And that the barons say in the same sentence, you should leave her because she hasn't given you a male child. And you should also leave her because she's a demon. Historians never pay attention to the second part of that sentence. Right? And the thing is, there is actually much more evidence that, in terms of chronicles of this time and other kind of writings of this time, many more records from this time say that he got rid of her because he thought she was a demon than say they got rid of her because he didn't have a son by her. So
Mhm.
that's something I wanted to pay attention to.
I mean, you would think that people would be used to that because the Angevins were supposed to be descended from demons as well. There's a storied
Exactly.
tradition of having demons in
Exactly.
the family.
I know, I know. There are lots of them. It's coming from both directions that you
Yeah.
see. There are lots of stories circulating, in the late 12th century about a nobleman, a king who runs across some mysterious, beautiful woman who entrances him and he marries her. And only later that he discovers that she is kind of from the other side. But Cesare Heisterback, who's a writer, Cistercian writer from the early 13th century, he makes some passing comment. He's talking about people descended from demons, and he says, they're the kings of England, who are descended from demon, but they seem fine.
Yeah, it seems all right, except for that one thing. No problem.
In the chronicles about Richard, people regularly refer to him as such a great warrior that he's compared to a demon. And
Yes.
Arab chroniclers that refer to him as a demon. That seems to be a pretty good thing to be, right? Because it gave them this kind of extra force. I mean, a warrior who's a demon is pretty scary. You can see how you later would kind of like that rumor to be circulating.
Well, if Eleanor's able to cross the mountains in her 80s, she must be supernatural.
Good argument.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is just such an interesting figure, and it's just great to spend a whole episode chatting about her. So thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your questions. It's such a pleasure to speak with someone who knows this material and has a response to it.
Thank you. To find out more about Karen's work, you can visit her faculty page at Bard College at bard.edu. Her new book is Eleanor of Aquitaine, as it was said, Truth and Tales about the Medieval Queen. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalistsnet to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. I guess the big news this week is about the Cerne Abbey giant. You might be familiar this in the English countryside. There's this big chalk drawing of a naked guy with a club.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been there. People have been looking at it for hundreds of years, and they've always been wondering about its origins. A few years ago, they came out with radiocarbon dating to figure out it's from the early Middle Ages. And now there's a new article in Speculum that it is an image of Hercules.
Ooh, very cool.
Yeah, so this article goes into detail about why it would be Hercules. Apparently, he had his moments during the Middle Ages where he is a little popular. And now it may have been a depiction to be seen from this meeting point that was nearby. Nice way to hey, this is where we meet, where you look over and you see Herc.
Can't miss him.
Yeah, and then they go into a bit of his history, how the Cerne Abbey eventually started to change him from Hercules to a local saint.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very fascinating article. So we have that news.
Awesome. I mean, people have been interested in that, as you say, for a very long time. So I'm sure everyone will be interested in reading more about it.
We also have stuff from Laura Chevalier on medieval hand warmers, which is appropriate for this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
And George Theotokos has a piece on who's to blame for the Byzantine loss at Manzikert.
I know he's been working a lot on that battle, so he has things to say.
Yeah, and Manzikert is one of those battles that gets constantly talked about. So a lot of emotions running high, even after 950 years or so.
Perfect. Well, thanks for stopping by and telling us what's on the website this week.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through Medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of amazing goodies, like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of Medievalist.net and this podcast. And if you're a member of the book club this month, I hope you'll enjoy my book, How to Live Like a Monk, which will hopefully get you started off on the right foot this year, courtesy of Abbeville Press. If your New Year's resolution is to support your favorite podcaster through patronage, I hope you'll check out patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from rumors to humors, follow Medievalistsnet on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.